Welcome back to some of you. I do recognize a couple of those names. For those of you who have not been here before, we are the Marine Environmental Education Center located out on Hollywood Beach. We have been trying to do a lot of virtual programming and webinars since we are still closed and a lot of places are still closed. We want to make it so people still have resources. Today we are lucky enough to be working with awesome Dr. Dean Grubbs. So he is the Associate Director of Research at Florida State University's Coastal and Marine Lab. He is a fish ecologist focused on poorly studied estuary and marine taxa. And he specializes in the use of fishery independent surveys to study population dynamics and life histories. So he has a ton of really cool experience with a lot of unique species that we don't talk about as much. So today he's actually going to be telling us about his research, I think most specifically sawfish. If you guys have any questions, throw them in the chat. He will answer them at the end. If you guys have any issues, please put them in the chat. We're going to keep everyone muted just so everyone can hear Dean more clearly. But Christina, Carly, and I are monitoring the chat to try and make sure that if you have an issue, we could help. Otherwise, take it away whenever you're ready, Dean.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for the intro, Taylor. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. Says my screen share is disabled by the host.
Sorry, now you should be able to.
All right, cool. And this one. All right, can you guys all see that? Perfect. Okay, great. So yeah, so like Taylor said, I study both coastal and deep sea fish, and I'm at the FSU Coastal and Marine Lab. And in case you're wondering where that is in the world, so here's the state of Florida. And right there, that little star about an hour south of Tallahassee, that's where the FSU Coastal and Marine Lab is located. And so I do study coastal and deep sea fishes. This little emblem here of my, that's my little lab's emblem, and it kind of gives you an idea of the critters we study: sharks, cownose rays, sawfish I'm going to talk about today, as well as some other weird things like hagfish and catfish and you name it. So we study a lot of different things. Most of my work is on sharks and rays, and it's mostly on some of the bigger critters that are harder to study, things that don't really like it when you try to catch them and study them. Things like this is a big 6-gill shark in the Gulf of Mexico off Florida. That's our biggest shark that's found in the deep water regions. And when I say deep water, I mean 700 feet to 7,000 feet deep. And then this is a sawfish in the top left, and that's what I'm going to mostly talk about today. So this kind of gives you an idea of where my lab works. And so we do a lot of deep sea work in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as in various places in the Bahamas like Bimini and Eleuthera. And we do a lot of coastal shark work along the Big Bend coastline of Florida up here. And so we tag about 2,000 to 3,000 sharks a year right in that region. And then we work on sawfish, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And that's mostly in South Florida, in the Everglades and the Florida Keys, and then also in the Bahamas, we're doing work on sawfish. And so you're probably by now wondering what a sawfish is. So I'm gonna tell you that in a second. So this actually, you know, if I asked you how many species of sharks there were in Florida, usually when I ask that question, I get answers that are like, 5 or 10 species or something like that. These are all sharks and rays that we've caught in Florida waters. So there's over 100, or right around 100 species of sharks and rays. There's about 1,250 species of sharks and rays in the world. And so we have about 100 of those in Florida waters. The ones up on the top two are sharks and rays that are found in coastal zones or shallow water. The ones down below are sharks and skates that are found in deep sea waters. So we actually have about half of the species of sharks and rays in Florida are found only in the deep ocean, and about half are found in the coastal or pelagic zone. So one of the rays that I specifically want to talk about is one of the coastal ones, and that's the sawfish, smalltooth sawfish specifically. So, I titled this, Is There Hope for One of Our Largest, Most Endangered Marine Predators? And so this is a big predator. And as you're going to see, they are an endangered species. And we're fortunate that the bulk of the sawfish found in the Atlantic Ocean are probably found in Florida waters, which is pretty cool. So what is a sawfish? So a sawfish is a very small family of very large rays. And so 5 species worldwide, only one that's found in the US and in the Bahamas, and that's the smalltooth sawfish. Of the 5 species that are found worldwide, 4 of them get at least 16 feet long. So these are big animals, real big animals. And so all of these pictures are sawfish that we've caught doing our research in Florida. And so you can see it's this weird looking ray with this big hedge trimmer looking thing on the end of its head. So it's got this big saw on the end of its head. You're probably asking, what is that for? That's weird. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's get to the fact that these are rays. And when I say rays, I mean they're more closely related to a stingray than they are to a shark. But if you look at that photo right there, the top left one, that superficially looks like more like a shark than a ray, right? And so if you don't know the difference between a shark and a ray, I'm going to just give you a real quick primer on that. So this is a lemon shark on the left, and this is a southern stingray on the right, 2 of our most common sharks and rays. You obviously recognize this as a shark. You obviously recognize this as a ray. Well, what makes one a shark and one a ray? They're actually very closely related. Those of us that are shark nerds that study sharks for a living, we like to refer to these rays as essentially pancake sharks, because they're basically just flat sharks is all they are. But the big difference between them is that, and if you look at this sawfish here, you'll see that this sawfish looks superficially more like a shark. It's got the big dorsal fins, it's got a tail, a caudal fin, more similar to that lemon shark. Well, but notice that the gill slits on that shark are on the side, right on the side of its face, of its neck, with the pectoral fins basically attached down below those gills. This stingray actually has its gills underneath, so you can't see its gills when it's in this orientation. Its pectoral fins, the equivalent of its arms, are basically, or wings, if you want to think of it as a bird, are attached to its head over the gills. So the gills are on the bottom. And now if we take, that's basically the only real difference between a shark and a ray. They're very closely related otherwise. Well, if we take this sawfish and we flip it upside down, what you'll see is there's its gill slits. Its gills are underneath. So it is a ray. It's more closely related to your stingrays than to a shark. Of course, the thing that is obvious about them is they have this really weird rostrum. And notice this one that we've caught here is just shaking that rostrum. It's got teeth all over that rostrum. They can actually use that rostrum both defensively to defend themselves. And the research boat that we do all of our research on has holes poked all in the side of the boat from them trying to get us. They can cause a lot of damage if when you're handling them. And so we tell everybody, if you catch one, to cut the line as closely to the rostrum as you can, but don't get too close to that rostrum. And that's what it's called, a rostrum. And it's got these teeth on the side. In addition to using that rostrum for defense, they use it to feed and to kill their prey, basically. There's very dense electroreceptors on the underside of the rostrum, so they can detect the electrical fields that buried prey would create. But they also use that rostrum to really stun and kill their prey. And in fact, this right here on this tooth you see, that's the scale of a big redfish. Any of you who fish out in the flats would know what a redfish is. And so that's a redfish scale right there. And if you see this lower left photo, this thing hanging out of its mouth right there, that's a shark. That's a shark tail, a 3-foot Atlantic sharp-nosed shark that this sawfish swallowed whole. So these things are major predators in the areas they live. They fill a similar part of the food web as a bull shark. So they're among top predators in our coastal marine environment. And if you look at this picture on the top right, what you see is these are actually the wounds in a black-nosed shark where it's been whacked, basically. It's been hit by the teeth of one of these sawfish. In this photo, you can see I'm actually pulling a sharp-nosed shark, it's about 3 feet long, out of the mouth of a sawfish. So swallowed it whole. And so these are serious predators in our waters. Unfortunately, so there are 5 species of sawfish worldwide, and unfortunately, all 5 are either listed as endangered or critically endangered. They are one of, if not the most endangered families of marine fish in the world. The species we have, of course, is the smalltooth sawfish here, and it's a critically endangered species. Why are they endangered? Well, for many years, they were targeted commercially, both for the meat and just to have that saw, the rostrum, and just hang it on the wall as a curio. These are all photos from Florida from back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. There's actually a commercial fishery. This top left photo is from a commercial fishery for sawfish in the Florida Keys in the 1910 teens and 20s. And so they were overfished by targeted fishing. Also sport fishing. It became very vogue to just come down to the Florida Keys on vacation, and fishermen would go and catch a big sawfish, take their picture with it. They would usually just cut the rostrum off and take it home as a curio and then just throw the rest away. So sport fishing was a major cause of their overfishing. Obviously, they get quite large. So this is actually a rostrum that's in my office that someone gave me. The guy who gave it to me, it's 4 feet long. The sawfish is about 16 feet long in total. This rostrum was caught in Indian River Lagoon in the year 1872. 1872, so that's almost 150 years ago. It's signed by the guy's grandfather who caught it there in Indian River Lagoon. So that's one of the causes that of them being endangered is just people catching them just for this rostrum. Bycatch mortality is a big cause of their decline in population as well. You can imagine if they've got this snoot, this rostrum with teeth on the side, any kind of net is gonna have there's gonna be an entanglement danger. So they get caught in shrimp trawls, they get caught in gill nets. And probably historically, when gill netting was legal in Florida, that was a major source of decline of the juveniles. Now gill netting is illegal in Florida. But we still get all of our shrimp through shrimp trawling. And bycatch in shrimp trawls, like this one here is in a shrimp trawl off of South Florida. That's probably the #1 source of decline now of sawfish. And then on top of that, they do have some pretty specific habitat requirements. As juveniles, sawfish need red mangroves. They need the mangroves very badly. And so without mangroves, with us losing our mangroves due to various forms of deforestation in Florida, it's due to agriculture, it's due to building of urbanization, building of high rises, tourism. All of those things cause a loss of this habitat that this little baby sawfish needs. So conservation action. Sawfish have actually been protected in Florida since 1992. As I mentioned, all 5 species are listed as endangered or critically endangered now. In the year 2003, smalltooth sawfish became the first marine fish, saltwater fish, listed as endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And so they've been protected in Florida since 92 and throughout the United States since 2003. As part of that endangered species listing, we had to basically come up with what is the most important habitats that we know of for sawfish. They're called critical habitats. And 2 areas were highlighted. One is the area down in Florida Bay throughout Everglades National Park and 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge, which is a relatively pristine area of intact mangroves. And then also the Caloosahatchee River Charlotte Harbor area up around Fort Myers is another area of sawfish critical habitat. But of course, we've lost a lot of the mangroves from that area up there. And that area is obviously highly altered. And so one of the things we did in my lab was actually look at baby sawfish in each of these two areas, an area that's pristine in the Everglades and an area that's pretty polluted up in the Fort Myers, Charlotte Harbor area. And what we actually found, that's what my student Bianca is doing right here. She's taking blood from a tiny little sawfish to look to in the blood, we can actually tell how stressed out the sawfish is. Not just from being captured, but just the baseline stress of living in a polluted area versus a non-polluted area. And what we found is that even just this living in a polluted area causes stress on these baby sawfish. And so these animals need intact mangroves. This is one of the main nursery areas for sawfish in the Everglades. There you can see a baby sawfish being caught in one of our experimental gill nests. This is one put out by my NOAA colleagues. And the reason they need these sawfish is it gives them these mangroves, gives them a hiding place. So whenever this tide drops out, the sawfish tend to lay in these little ditches, like this little puddle here. But of course, sharks can't live in that little puddle. But when the tide comes in, sharks will come in here. And so the sawfish will move up into those mangroves. And so you can see this one, he's right on the edge. And as that tide comes in, he'll move up into those mangrove roots to get away from potential predators. And so this is a bull shark here, where you can look in its mouth and see that's the rostrum of a baby sawfish sticking out of the mouth of this bull shark. So they need these mangroves in order to hide. And so a lot of the work we've been doing is we're curious if the sawfish, we know they're the largest known population for sawfish in the Atlantic Ocean is in Florida. And what we're curious about is if there are other populations in other areas, for example, in the Bahamas or in Cuba. And if there are they all part of the same population? In other words, do sawfish from Florida swim to the Bahamas or to Cuba and vice versa? So that's one of the main things that we've been trying to look at. And so the way we catch these big sawfish is, this is in the Everglades here in Florida. We set out lines that have 50 baited hooks on them. We only leave those out for an hour before we retrieve them. We leave them only for an hour because we don't want any of the sharks that we're going to catch on the line to be killed. And so once we get a sawfish on the line, here you can see us working up a large one. You have to get that rostrum under control because you can see how strong they are and how fast they will swing that thing. And so this one here, he hit me in the head, and almost right there, you can see he hit me in the cheek just a little bit. And so they can be pretty dangerous. And so you got to get that rostrum under control. And then we'll tie the animal up alongside the boat. Remember, they're batoids, they're rays, like stingrays, so they can just lay there and breathe. They don't need to swim to breathe. Once we have the animal there, we'll count the teeth, we'll take photos of the rostrum, we'll also take genetic samples, we'll put tags on them. This one you can see I just put a hole through its dorsal fin to put a satellite tag on them. So that tag will record temperature, depth, and light levels for about 6 months, and then it will pop off. I program it on the computer to release from the sawfish, swim to it will float to the surface, and I'll get all the data from that tag. And by the light levels, we can actually tell sort of where the sawfish has been during that period. And then the last thing, we take blood, and that blood is used not only to measure the stress, but also it allows us to tell if that animal is a juvenile or if it's an adult. If it's an adult, it can tell us, that blood can tell us whether, if it's a female, whether she's pregnant or whether she's ready to mate, things like that. So we get a lot of information from that blood as well. And then we will release the animal and it'll swim back down. This is in deeper, more clear water here in the Florida Keys. And you can see once we release it, it just swims right back down to its home habitat. And so they're really quite tough, these animals are. So we've done over 600 of those sets like I just showed you. The little green dots on this map are areas where we've done a set and not caught a sawfish. And then the little bubbles are places where we actually caught sawfish. So we've caught 64 big sawfish in the last 10 years. And we've caught over 2,400 sharks in addition to those 64 sawfish. And so you can sort of see that they're distributed in two areas. Either we're catching them mostly in the northern part of Florida Bay, or we're catching them down through the Florida Keys, particularly right on the edge of the reef track where it gets deep. This is right along where it's about 150 to 200 feet deep. So they're either like 150, 200 feet deep off the Keys, or we get them up in here where it's only like 10 feet deep. So two main areas. The first area is the northern part of Florida Bay. That's where they tend to get caught by recreational fishermen a lot. Chocolate milk looking water, very, very dark water in this area. This is also the main habitat for another critter. I don't know how many of you recognize that. It's not an alligator. That's actually a crocodile. That's an American crocodile, which was an endangered species, and it's actually one of our conservation success stories. They've recovered and have been down listed on the Endangered Species Act. And these guys are found right in the main area where we catch sawfish too. So you can imagine when I'm in the water like this, getting blood and working up a big sawfish, I'm always looking around for that crocodile there. So far, no crocodiles have eaten me, so I'm good so far. The other area we catch them is right along that edge of the Florida Keys, as I mentioned, which is really clear water, usually offshore of where there's a lot of current flow through the Keys system that provides a lot of food for the sawfish, and even food for the sawfish's food, for that matter. More recently, we've shifted away from those satellite tags you just saw me putting on that sawfish, and we started actually surgically implanting a acoustic or a sound producing transmitter that's about the size of my index finger. And that tag will last for 10 years, a battery that will last for 10 years. And we implant it and then surge it and then sew them shut, just like regular sutures that a surgeon would use. And then every time for 10 years, every time that sawfish swims by one of these receivers, that's a receiver right there on that PVC post, when it swims within a few hundred yards of that receiver will say, okay, this sawfish passed at this time on this day. And so we can get a lot of information over many years on the movements of these sawfish. And so, for example, all of these little bubbles are places where we had receivers in part of Everglades National Park. This is Chokoloskee Island here, for anybody who's familiar with Everglades National Park and Everglades City area. And so every time one of our sawfish swims close to one of these receivers, we'll know it. Well, this is just about 30 receivers that we had out, but there's actually this huge group of researchers throughout the Gulf of Mexico and up the Atlantic Ocean that have similar receivers out. And so there are actually now thousands and thousands of these receivers. And so anytime one of our sawfish passes by a receiver that doesn't even belong to us, we're going to know about it, which allows us to really start tracking the movements of these animals. I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. So just since 2016, we've tagged 43 big sawfish with these acoustic transmitters, and they've been detected 150,000 times on 500 receivers. And those receivers have been, so these are all sawfish we tagged down here in the Florida Keys and the Everglades, and they've been detected up off of Tampa. They've been detected all the way up to right here on one of my own receivers, right here off of my marine lab in the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And then the Atlantic, a lot of them that have been picked up around Cape Canaveral, and then even as far north as Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of information we can get. So this is just one animal, a male, about 12 feet long, that we tagged right in where this one April 2017 is. We tagged that animal there, and in 3 weeks, he swam all the way to Cape Canaveral. He hung out there around Cape Canaveral for about 2 weeks, and then he came back down, and a month later was all the way down in the lower Florida Keys, around Key West. Then, in 2 months, he went up and was off of Tampa, offshore of Tampa, Florida. He didn't like it up there, I guess, because then he came back down by November, back down to the lower Florida Keys, the Key West. Then he hung out in that area for a few months over the winter months and basically throughout the Florida Keys tract. And then went back up to Cape Canaveral again, showing up on the exact same day 1 year later that he showed up there on the first time. Then he went back down, spent his winter again down in the Florida Keys, and then he went back the following April. So 3 Aprils in a row within a few days of each other. This animal has gone from Key West basically to Cape Canaveral. Pretty cool that we can actually track that animal as it moves over multiple years like that. Pretty awesome to be able to do that. Of course, what we're really curious about is whether these animals actually stay in Florida or if they move to the Bahamas. So far, none of those that we had tagged had really been detected in the Bahamas, but there aren't that many receivers in the Bahamas either to pick them up. So we decided to start doing work in the Bahamas, and what we found out is that the only records that we could find of sawfish in the Bahamas were mostly concentrated on 2 islands or near 2 islands. This is the island of Andros, the biggest island in the Bahamas here. This is the island of Bimini, which is the closest island to the United States, closest Bahamian island to the United States. So if these sawfish are moving from Florida to the Bahamas, they probably go through Bimini, we would think. And so we started in 2010 doing trips. We basically take this little boat all the way from Tallahassee, Florida, trailer it to Miami, then go across the Gulf Stream to Bimini, and then go to Andros to do work on these on sawfish down there. This was our very first time ever being to Andros in 2010 to try to catch sawfish. We didn't have our lines with us at that time, and so we were stuck just trying to catch them with dip nets and little snares. And we did actually we found 2 on our very first trip, and we did manage to catch them. This was on a part of a documentary for the National Geographic channel. You can see I had much shorter hair than I did in these later videos. We did catch it, and we tagged 2 of those with satellite tags. And you can see we're going to release it here. And you can see the little satellite tag trailing from its dorsal fin right there. But we still hadn't at this point ever, as far as we knew, there was no juveniles, no babies in the Bahamas. So everybody thought that maybe sawfish in the Bahamas all came from Florida and that they were all born in Florida. And then a couple of years ago, we caught this fish here. She was 14 feet long, and the first really big one we had caught in the Bahamas in Andros. And so the first thing we do is we get her tied up alongside, my student Bianca gets in the water with her and gets blood so we can see what her reproductive status is and also see what her stress levels are. But the really cool thing came when we flipped her upside down to start doing the transmitter implant, the surgery. You can see there's something happening right here. Those are actually the rostra of 2 baby sawfish trying to be born. They're being born. And so the ones that were struggling to get out at the same time, we actually helped them get out. And so these were babies this female was in there shallow giving birth to her pups. This is the first time this has been seen anywhere in the world that we're aware of, anybody observing sawfish being born. And these are the same size as the baby sawfish we catch in Florida. So we know that they're ready to be born. So clearly she was in there giving birth. So this is our first evidence that sawfish do indeed give birth in the Bahamas. And so maybe they're a completely separate population. You can see there's this little sheath around the rostral teeth that protects those teeth while they're being born, and also probably protects the mom from these little needle sharp teeth. We put little pit tags. They're basically the same microchips that you would put in your dog or your cat to identify your dog or your cat. We put those in the little babies and then release them. Notice the female just knocked my colleague, Dr. Krutz, over. That was when the female just gave birth to 2 more on her own. We had helped 3 of them get born, and then 2 of them were born on their own. And, and we managed to just catch both of them by hand. You can see the guy up front here, Jake, has one of them in his hands, and another one's about to come swimming by. My student, Brian Keller, is about to grab that one. And so there were 5 of these babies that we were able to sample and tag and release. But that wasn't the whole litter. We actually could feel that the mom still had others that she probably went on to give birth to. And here's probably the first video ever of a newborn sawfish swimming. This has been on Shark Week and stuff like that. Jake Jerome filmed this. And so that's a little newborn sawfish. You can see it's a little uncoordinated at first. Why wouldn't it be with that big old thing on the front of its head? But after a few minutes, they get their bearings. They swim just fine. So this is the first evidence that now we know they do give birth in the Bahamas. This is a drone shot of what the habitat looks like in the Bahamas. You can see it's very, very different than what we saw in the Everglades. And mangroves aren't nearly as thick in this area, and they're mostly using these creeks, just a few creeks on the northwest side of that island. But we also have put out a whole bunch of receivers in this area, just like the ones in Florida. And so far, what we've seen is that it actually turns out that mom, the female sawfish that was pregnant, she actually had already been sampled once in Bimini in 2002. And then we caught her 14 years later, well, almost 15 years later in 2016. She then moved to the edge of the shelf in the Bahamas and then to Bimini, and then back to Andros, back to Bimini, back to Andros. It's a very similar pattern that what we're seeing in Florida. It seems that she's not leaving the Bahamas. In fact, she's not even leaving this big, huge sandbar called the Great Bahama Bank right here. And so what this tells us so far, and we've actually tagged 7 big sawfish in the Bahamas now, 43 in Florida. And so far, there doesn't seem to be any exchange. Those in Florida stay in Florida. Those we tag in the Bahamas stay in the Bahamas. That suggests these are 2 very separate populations. And that's important when we're talking about recovery of this population. And so these in the Bahamas are just on the Great Bahama Bank. We've got some evidence that there may be a 3rd population here on the Little Bahama Bank area called Abaco. We actually got a photo of a small juvenile here in Abaco. This is the area that was hit very, very hard by Hurricane Dorian last year. We did make one trip to Abaco, and we managed to tag 1 large juvenile sawfish. Here you can see I'm fighting it on rod and reel. It was about 10 feet long. That's still a baby. That's still a juvenile, 10 feet long. So it may be that this is another population altogether, but we don't know much about that one yet. Our next steps are also, we're working with Cuban researchers to do work on sawfish in Cuba. We know, we've done surveys and know there are sawfish in Cuba. But in terms of the status of the populations, it could be that there's basically 4 separate populations in this little region, which is important for basically the possibility that the population will recover, or that the species will recover from being critically endangered. Because importantly, the Florida population, the U.S. population, which is concentrated in Florida, all of our evidence says that it's actually recovering. From an endangered species standpoint, this is a success story that we're seeing sawfish recover in Florida. But we don't know what's happening in the Bahamas. And unlike Florida, where they've been protected since 1992, sawfish still are not protected in the Bahamas. And it seems to be a pretty small population. So that's what we're working on now, is trying to get them protected in the Bahamas. And then there's the Cuban population. We don't know what their status is, whether it's increasing or decreasing, but sawfish are protected in Cuba, which is good news there. So that's sort of where we're going next, or some of these other populations to start looking at recovery of sawfish there. And so that sort of gives you a thumbnail of what we're doing. We're doing a lot of other work on sawfish, both juveniles and adults, but I just wanted to give you sort of a really coarse look at some of the research we've been doing. And I'm going to leave it there. The last thing I'll do is give you a shameless plug for any of you who are interested in shark biology. This is a shark biology textbook that's out for sale right now that my colleague Dan Abel and I wrote, and it basically mirrors a shark biology class that we've been teaching. We've taught it both for high school and college courses over the years, and this book really sort of follows that course. And so I'll stop it there and stop my sharing, and I'm happy to address any questions there may be. Taylor, you want me to read them, or do you want to?
Whatever you prefer. We do have a couple that people have just been putting through the chat. So you're welcome to scroll through and answer them at your leisure.
All right, here, I'll take let's see, I'll try to go in order. Have I seen a whale shark? I've seen whale sharks. I've never been in the water with one though. You know, that's one of the interesting things. People ask about whale sharks and you know, are there whale sharks in Florida and everything? And most people may know there are whale sharks. You do see them off South Florida occasionally and everything, but they're actually a lot more common than you know, one actually washed ashore on Sanibel Island last year. But there's actually, if you look there, I have some aerial photos that my colleague Eric Hoffmeyer took in the northern Gulf of Mexico, in the panhandle of Florida through Louisiana, where there's like 90 whale sharks in one image. Because they really aggregate in the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico to feed on the eggs of a small species of tuna called a little tunny. And so there can actually be hundreds of whale sharks in Florida at certain times of the year. Have bull sharks had issues digesting sawfish? Yeah, you know, you imagine that probably would be pretty difficult swallowing down a toothed rostrum, but you know, sharks don't really have the types of nerve endings to feel pain in their jaws and their mouth, and so they probably digest it pretty quickly. I've prepared shark jaws from great hammerhead sharks and pulled more than 100 stingray spines out of a single shark jaw. So if they can take getting stingray spines stuck all in their tissue, I think that the sawfish will go down just fine. How big was the biggest sawfish we caught? The biggest we've ever caught was right at about 16 feet, and that seems to be the biggest they get. The biggest male, the females are a little bit bigger than the males, which is common with a lot of sharks and rays. The biggest female was about 16 feet, the biggest male was about 14.5 feet long. So I don't think they get too much bigger than that. Thank you, then I'm amazing, I appreciate that. At what age does the sheet covering around the baby sawfish disappear, and what's it made of? All right, so the first question is pretty easy. It's about a week. If you catch one of those babies after about 4 or 5 days, you'll notice that it's disintegrating. It's just falling apart, and then a week later, it's gone and the teeth have emerged. In terms of what it's made of, it's protein and collagen, but we don't really know what all's in it. It hadn't really been analyzed in great detail, but it's essentially really thin precursors to what their skin would be made of. Oh, good question. What ecological role do sawfish play in the environment? So they fill a similar role, but slightly different to what a bull shark would play. So they're at that very top, at the very top of the food chain. They're you know, people like to talk about apex predators. In a lot of marine systems, you don't have a single apex predator. You have several species that fill that top predator role, and so sawfish fill that role. And so you know, to have any sort of healthy ecosystems, you need intact the entire food web. And so maintaining that top of the food chain intact and healthy is critical to having a healthy and functioning marine ecosystem. And so they fill a very important role there at the top of the food chain. What do they eat? So they eat almost exclusively fish. And so they basically whack the fish with that rostrum to stun them or knock them out. And then they basically swallow them whole after that. They don't have sharp teeth like a shark, so they can't bite their food into pieces. So they mostly swallow it whole. It's pretty much just fish. They'll eat things like small mullet and pilchards as juveniles. And then they'll move up to eating small stingrays and things like redfish and stuff like that as adults. Any idea what drives the swimming pattern? So I assume you're probably asking about what makes that one go all the way up to Cape Canaveral during the summer and then back down. That's a pretty common migration pattern of a lot of bigger fish. A lot of our sharks will keep on going. Sharks like blacktip sharks and things will keep on going all the way up to the Carolinas or to Virginia and beyond. But so it's partially temperature regulated. It gets really hot in South Florida. And one of the interesting things is we've seen that some of our sawfish don't make that movement north. They actually go to deep water where it's cooler, and then others go north and follow cooler water north. They're not necessarily just following that temperature though. They're also following their prey, because most things migrate north in the spring and south in the fall. And so they're following things like mullet and other fish that are going on doing that same type of migration. Do they use their display to display aggression or mating behavior within their species? So we don't. So in terms of mating, what we do know is that the mating process you do end up with mating scars. We've actually found areas where they mate in Florida, in the Everglades and in the Florida Keys, where you catch them and they will have fresh scars all over their bodies, which are clearly from the rostrum. And so they definitely do hit each other during that mating. No one's ever observed the mating, so we don't know exactly how it works. I saw courtship behaviors in Atlantis Aquarium in the Bahamas, and there the male would sort of vibrate his rostrum, and maybe that's to try to get the female interested in mating, but we never saw mating take place. There is some evidence from a different species of sawfish in aquariums in Australia of them actually using it aggressively, where they actually one will pin the other to the ground with its rostrum in order to try to get to food. So if you drop food in the tank, one will try to use the rostrum to get the other one out of the way so it gets the food first. Now, whether they do that in the wild or not, we don't know, but they've definitely done that in an aquarium. Have you noticed a decline in the population in the Caloosahatchee? What's the main reason for that? So overall, the Caloosahatchee area population is part of the same population that's also in the Everglades. All of our evidence suggests that both of those populations, that whole population is increasing slowly, but it's increasing from a very low level. It declined by probably 95%, at least 90% from 1950 to the 1990s. And then of course it was listed as endangered in 2003. And so strict protections have led to them increasing. There is concern though that both changes in freshwater flow across the Everglades, as well as the Lake Okeechobee releases and associated red tide issues and things like that, could affect the suitability of the habitat. And there's no doubt, like I mentioned, with the juveniles that we looked at, the ones that are in the Caloosahatchee area definitely seem to have higher levels of just chronic stress, physiological stress, than the ones in the Everglades. And so that may be associated with various pollutants, including what happens when there are releases from Lake Okeechobee. Do their teeth fall off? And if they do they grow back? They do not grow back. And they don't fall off naturally. Now, they keep growing throughout their lives. And so if they break a tooth but don't break it completely, that tooth will keep growing. But if they break a tooth off completely, the skin will just heal over that opening, and there just won't be a tooth. There'll be one missing. You can obviously see where it's missing, but they don't actually grow back. What do I do in my profession? So I'm an associate director of research at the FSU Coastal Marine Lab, and so essentially I'm a research professor. So I only teach on the side. I teach for various universities at different places, but only like immersion courses, like intensive shark biology courses and things like that. Mostly I'm a research biologist, so I have graduate students in my lab, I have undergraduate students in my lab, and so I spend a lot of time doing research. And then also we do research that is answering specific questions needed for conservation or management. So all of my, I often advise, you know, NOAA, FWC, international conservation bodies on, you know, policies and management plans using the data that we collect. So.
Very cool. I think that was our last question. So thank you so much, Dr. Grubbs. That was really cool, really interesting. Not something we get to talk about a lot here at the MEEC. So we really appreciate you coming in and giving this talk.
No problem. Happy to do it.
If any of you guys have any questions that you think of later, feel free to send them to meec@nova.edu, MEEC. If we can't answer it, we will send them along to Dr. Grubbs because he knows all of the things. If you missed the beginning of this for any reason, it is recorded. So we are going to do a little bit of editing and then post it to our YouTube channel. So keep an eye out there. Otherwise, this Thursday at 1 p.m., we do have Marianne Porter coming in and giving us a talk. It is going to be a very Chondrichthyes themed week. We are talking about sharks again on Thursday. So join us then if you are free. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, guys. Hopefully we'll see you all soon.
All right, thank you guys.
Dr. Grubbs.
Thank you guys very much.